Let's get started. Tonight we are joined by Chelsea Follett. Chelsea is a policy analyst at the CATO Institute and is the managing editor of humanprogress.org, a project of the CATO Institute that seeks to educate the public on the global improvements in well-being by providing free empirical data on long-term developments. Chelsea's writing has been published in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Newsweek, Forbes, The Hill, Business Insider, National Review, The Washington Examiner, and Global Policy Journal. She was named to Forbes 30 Under 30 for 2018 in the category of Law and Policy. She earned a BA in Government and English from the College of William & Mary, as well as an MA in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia, where she focused on international relations and political theory. Chelsea is married to Club for Growth's senior research analyst, Andrew Follett, and together they have 2 children and 1 on the way. Chelsea, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
Absolutely. Well, I am fascinated by your book. When Andrew was telling me what you had done, I knew we had to have you on to talk to our fellows. It's essentially a crash course in history, and spoiler, it really serves to reinforce the ideas that we know allow for the greatest human progress throughout history, and those are the ideas of freedom and opportunity. So tell us a little bit about your process, your definitions, when, why, how did you come to the conclusion that you needed to write a book about cities, and why the term progress? Can you define that for us?
Absolutely. So progress, obviously people define it in different ways, and sometimes they use a politicized definition, and it reminds people of progressives, and so people don't like the word, but this book uses a completely non-political definition of progress, just anything that furthers human well-being, non-controversially. Most people would agree that life is better than death. It's better to be healthy than sick, rich than poor, literate rather than illiterate, and so on. And so that is the sort of progress that you can find measured on humanprogress.org, which tracks many metrics around the world of everything from falling rates of malnutrition to rising rates of prosperity and falling rates of poverty around the world, which we find, unsurprisingly, do correlate with policies of economic freedom and opportunity. And so I spent a lot of time as managing editor of humanprogress.org thinking about where progress comes from. And that was the question that inspired this book. I didn't set out for it to be about cities, but when I made a list of different aspects of the modern world, of modern civilization that we take for granted, everything from a stable food supply and sanitation to writing itself, so many of these innovations could be traced to particular places. And even when the vast majority of people lived in rural areas, it tended to be cities from which new innovations emerged and from which prosperity emerged and then would flow to outside areas. Even in the time period before cities, it tended to be the closest equivalents that did exist, the greatest gatherings of people that were around, from which we saw these innovations coming. And so the book ended up being about cities.
And remind us of the name of the book.
Centers of Progress, 40 Cities That Changed the World.
Okay, so 40 cities. Was there a reason for 40?
I could try to come up with some very deep, significant answer about how, in history, this is a number that many people associate with transformation and change. In scripture, we can think of the 40 days and 40 nights, right? But in reality, it's just that the book was getting too long at that point, so we had to cut it off somewhere.
Sure.
I probably easily could have gone on to 50 cities. It was.
Well, I'm really interested in what city 41 was. What was the city that got left out?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I did it in groups and batches of 10. So there wasn't one city that was cut out necessarily. But I do think because so many of the chapters are focused on innovations in transportation, there's a chapter on roads, there's a chapter on trains and so forth, it would have made sense to have a chapter focused on the rise of the automobile, which has been so transformational. So maybe Detroit or a city of that nature would have been number 41 if we continued.
So when you think back over the book, what do you think was for you the most significant city or progress? What were your favorite pieces of it?
No, that's a great question. We actually ran a contest or a tournament on Twitter, or the website formerly known as Twitter, now X, and had people vote for their favorite, and Athens won out easily. But the city, although I do love Athens and its contributions to philosophy should not be understated, the city that I found the most fascinating when researching and writing the book, because I didn't know much about it beforehand, was actually Dubrovnik. It's a city in modern day Croatia. It's been around for a very long time, though. In the medieval period, it was actually an independent city-state called the Republic of Ragusa. And at the time, it was a sort of medieval Hong Kong during Hong Kong's era of economic freedom. It was this free trading, seafaring supernova on a coast. And they became incredibly prosperous through policies of freedom. In fact, their flag was just the word libertas, well, Latin for liberty. Their motto as a city was, "Liberty is not sold for all the gold in the world." And if you count a city-state republic as a country, then they were among the earliest countries to actually ban the slave trade, because they valued liberty so highly for the time period. And they're featured in the book for their response to the Black Death pandemic, the plague. And they were among the first places in Europe when they were dealing with this devastating pandemic that was killing a third to a half of people in cities. It was the pandemic we just went through is nothing compared to what that was. They were among the first to formulate a coherent response to that. They invented limited quarantine waiting periods, and this actually allowed them to keep their ports open and continue trading. And they even achieved significant mercantile and economic expansion during the Black Death, whereas some other cities of the time, like Venice, another city-state that relied on trade, they had to completely close their walls and not let anyone in or out of the city for a time because of repeated plague outbreaks. And so I think that we can learn some lessons from Dubrovnik.
Yeah, that's great. So much to learn from history. Well, what are the common themes, in addition to what you've just mentioned, or values that you saw across these cities? Can you give us some examples of what those were?
Absolutely. So the first question that comes up is, why cities? Why is it that progress tended to emerge from urban areas, even when most people lived in rural ones? And so the common denominator there just seems to be people. Whenever you've got more people gathered together, in Adam Smith's words, to truck, barter, and exchange, you can achieve incredible economies of scale, more specialization. And when you have more people exchanging goods and services, and also ideas, more people engaging in debate and discussion, you're just more likely to hit upon a new idea that changes the world in a positive way. And with all the economic benefits of a larger population also, you get more prosperity that then can fund all of the other forms of progress, right? Scientific advancements, great artworks, and so forth. But not all cities become centers of innovation. So why some cities and not others? All cities have lots of people, but not all cities become major innovation centers. And that brings us to the next major theme, which is peace. Now, this runs counter to something that many people believe, which is that it is war that has driven forward scientific progress and innovation throughout history. And there's certainly some truth to that when it comes to things like weaponry. One example that people give of a technology that we all use in our daily lives that allegedly comes from war is the computer and the internet. Many people say if it weren't for World War II, we wouldn't have had those things as quickly as we ended up having them. But if you actually look at the people working at the time on early computing technology, you had people like Konrad Zuse in Germany, you had various Europeans, you had many Americans. And because of the war that was taking place, they were not able to learn about each other's work at all. Even the various Americans couldn't work together because of the secrecy inherent in war. And so while we can't rerun history and know whether we would have had computers and the internet faster without a world war, I think it's possible that we could be even farther along with technology than we are today. And throughout much of history, we see again and again that the most innovative and creative places on earth have typically been at peace. And that makes sense because what drives progress during war is competition, right? Competition, though to kill and to dominate and to be able to protect different areas of land. In peacetime, people are still competing, but what they are competing to do instead is to offer goods and services to one another that create value and that increase living standards. And so that's why in peacetime, competition tends to drive forward the kind of progress that changes the world in a way that we can all agree is positive. Now, even in peacetime, not all cities, of course, become major innovation centers. And so the last, but by no means least, common theme that seems to unite almost all of history's most innovative places is freedom. And that includes many kinds of freedom, political freedom, and so forth. But one kind of freedom that I do not think gets nearly enough credit is economic freedom. It's obvious how economic freedom can lead to the creation of new companies and businesses that serve people in various ways and make their lives better. But I don't think people realize just how many different kinds of progress can come from economic freedom. For example, writing was not invented to record the genealogies of kings and glorify them. It wasn't created for poetry. It was originally created by accountants for the purpose of bookkeeping. And many people may not know that Isaac Newton's Principia, the culmination of the scientific revolution, was originally funded and allowed to be published by donated funds by the heir to a thriving soap business, a soap mogul. So ultimately, it is the prosperity created by economic freedom that funds scientific advancement. And then there's art as well. So many people have this idea of the starving artist, that a true artist should seek no reward and just create art for its own sake. But if you look at history's most beloved and cherished artworks that are still enjoyed today, everything from the paintings of Renaissance Florence to the music, the classical music of Vienna, these cities were able to create so much beautiful and lasting artwork by making art incredibly lucrative. They attracted talent because the financial patronage, the financial incentive was so great. And by funding the artists and the great minds and incentivizing them all to come into one place to compete and collaborate, they created art that changed the world.
Love it. That was so cool. Those were probably two of my favorite cities in your book because it's just not something that you typically think of. So are there any cities that saw significant progress without these values? And is there anything that we can learn from that?
Absolutely. There are definitely some exceptions. For example, although you won't find this in the book, not all progress comes from cities, right? The Wright brothers first flew in an empty North Carolina field, and they came from the rural Midwest. People have made plenty of progress outside of cities as well. But overwhelmingly, it has been cities in which we've seen a disproportionate number of new innovations flow. And just as you can find exceptions to the rule that more people tend to create more progress, you can find exceptions to the rule about peace. Mainz in the book is probably the best example to this. It's a German city where Johannes Gutenberg, the inventor of the printing press, lived and worked. And that city was very much at war. It was unstable. There were many riots. There was eventually a civil war that tore the city apart. And as a result, many people fled the city, including many of Gutenberg's apprentices. And there was a diaspora of printmaking apprentices that went out to different corners of Europe and rapidly disseminated printmaking technology. And this transformed the continent, this new knowledge. So that would be an example where violence and chaos, rather than peace and stability, actually became a catalyst for positive change. And the lesson I took away from that is that even when you have all of the wrong conditions for progress, sometimes something good can still come of it. But when you have all of the right conditions, incredible innovation is just far more likely.
Sure. So there are some cities that you write about that currently exist as archaeological sites, and others that I don't necessarily think about as like beacons of human progress, like Baghdad. And you specifically write, I have a whole chapter on San Francisco and how the golden age you talk about rose and fell very quickly. So what ideas, themes, or policies lead to the fall or the demise of a place of progress?
The exact opposite of the policies that lead to progress, the loss of those values. And one of the darker lessons of the book is that the golden ages, the the peak point of creativity of so many of these great centers of progress throughout history are very brief, and the conditions for progress can very quickly be lost and must be cherished. So Baghdad's a great example. Baghdad is today one of the most dangerous cities in the world, and not a place anyone would think of as a center of progress. A long time ago, around the 9th century, during the Abbasid dynasty and what's called the Islamic Golden Age, it was, for the time, home to something called the House of Wisdom, and they invited scholars from many different lands, including Christians, people of other backgrounds, and they were all allowed to work freely, and they came up with incredible progress in areas as diverse as mathematics and astronomy. But then a faction took over the city that believed that you could not have any outside sources of knowledge besides the Quran, and they made things much harder for scholars from different religions and different backgrounds to work in the city. And even the native-born scholars who were Muslim were much more restricted in what they could say. And it just completely changed the environment, and they weren't able to engage in scientific inquiry the way they were before. And then the ultimate downfall also came in the form of war, the loss of that condition of progress called peace, right? And the Mongol invasion is said to have actually made the Tigris River run black with ink because of the loss of so much scholarship. So the lesson there is that a place can go from a center of progress to a place that no one would think of as a center of progress very rapidly. San Francisco is a more recent and close to home example of the same thing. It's the last city featured in the book because the book, it's chronological like most history books, right? It goes all the way from the beginning of agriculture and permanent settlement to the modern day and the digital revolution. Like you said, it's sort of a crash course in world history, but it's very accessible. Each chapter is just a few pages. These are bite-sized vignettes on different cities that changed the world. And San Francisco and the broader San Francisco Bay Area is featured for the digital revolution. But that chapter notes quite explicitly that even though this chapter is at the end of the book, it should not be taken as a model because its golden age is past. We now know that there is a huge homelessness problem in San Francisco and many other difficulties the city is facing related to that due to troubling policies that have been enacted and that have changed the environment there.
Circle back to Baghdad.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about what you learned when it comes to diversity and culture.
Absolutely. So when Baghdad was at its most open and they allowed people from different backgrounds, different faiths, different lands to gather into one place, they were able to make an incredible amount of progress. Al-Kindi, a Baghdadi philosopher who was at work at the time, has a famous quote that you can find in the book that goes something like, knowledge and truth can come from people from many different lands, and we should not be afraid of the truth no matter who speaks it. And at the time, this was a very open-minded sentiment. This was the Middle Ages, right? The Dark Ages, although some people don't like that term anymore. And that is, I think, what we can learn from them. Chang'an is another great example in the book. It was the easternmost stop along the Silk Road, once the largest trade route in the world. And as the easternmost stop and the source of much of the namesake silk that traveled along that road, that city was incredibly enriched by this unprecedented level of trade, and it became possibly the largest, possibly the wealthiest, certainly one of the wealthiest cities in the world at the time. And it was this dazzling cosmopolitan city. We know they had musical troupes from all different lands and so forth, food from a huge diversity of places. We take that for granted today, but at the time that was very unusual. And then there was a backlash to that, and there were actually massacres along the Silk Road of thousands of Silk Road merchants from different backgrounds, including Christians, Zoroastrians, Jews, Muslims, and others. Anyone who was seen as an outsider was seen as threatening, and there are quotes by various courtiers and other famous people at that time in Chang'an and China generally about the barbarians, who to them would be anyone beyond the Great Wall, who they felt were polluting their culture. And it became a much more closed society. And then, as with Baghdad, war brought about the ultimate downfall at the time, there wasn't much of a norm against conquest. Today, although sometimes borders are not respected, they are more respected than they were back then. Back then, being a wealthy, prospering society or city made you a target for invasion. And so that city was invaded many times. They were able to repel these invasions, but that was very costly. And then instability, political instability in other parts of the world made trade along that very long route, the Silk Road, increasingly dangerous, to the point where the level of trade dropped off precipitously, and Chang'an's prosperity suffered as a result.
Did any of these cities make a comeback?
Some cities in the book could be featured in multiple eras. London or Paris, for example, are cities that have seen many different innovations in different time periods of history, and it was almost difficult to choose what specifically to feature those cities for. But in general, one of the lessons from the book that I took away was that the next great center of progress isn't necessarily one that you'd predict. There are so many cities in this book, like Amsterdam, which rose from a small fishing village to be actually what many scholars think is the origin point of that liftoff in global wealth and prosperity from the famous hockey stick graph that absolutely changed the world, when suddenly the average level of income and the average life expectancy really skyrocketed. This small obscure fishing village ended up creating a proto-conglomerate, the first modern corporation. They created the first modern stock exchange. They created all these innovations in finance and allowed for so much creativity economically, and they changed the world. But no one would have seen that coming. Edinburgh during the Scottish Enlightenment is another great example. This was a relatively obscure, inhospitable, cold university town that had just emerged from a century of instability of various kinds to take the world by storm and become the center of taste making and the arts, the center of philosophy, of medical science, and so many other things during the Scottish Enlightenment. And of course, it was also the home of Adam Smith and the creation of economics, allowing humanity to think about policies that drive prosperity as we never had before. So it's hard to predict where the next great center of progress will emerge. And even if your city or your community or your state is today not the most economically free, or it's not doing that well, it's possible to turn things around.
Yeah, I love that. You end your book with a question: what will be the next great center of progress? No one can say for certain. You might be standing in it. And I love that. So our fellows, we were talking about this earlier, they're leaders across America, across sectors, and at every level of government. So what is your advice or the wisdom that you would give them as they lead and influence?
To not lose sight of the big picture and why this matters. With every policy that you pass, every decision that you make, you are affecting perhaps not just the trajectory of your community, your city, your state, and your constituents, but maybe even the world. If your city or your state becomes the next great hub of innovation, it could be world-changing. The inventions, the achievements, whether that's an artistic creation that's enjoyed for centuries down the line, or a scientific advancement that allows humanity to live longer, healthier lives. If the place where you govern becomes the next great center of progress, you are not only making life better for the people there today, but possibly for all of humanity for centuries to come.
That's good. That's so good, especially at a time where there are attacks on the free market and economic freedom, and from both the left and the right. So I think it is of vital importance that our leaders and those making the laws realize that they cannot dictate progress, but they can foster an environment that facilitates opportunity and freedom for people to engage and create and innovate. So
absolutely. Another thing that they can do potentially is look to the great policymakers of the past. One featured in the book is Sir John Cowperthwaite, the former financial secretary of Hong Kong. And that chapter features Hong Kong for its whirlwind rise to prosperity in the 60s and 70s after Capbraithwaite instituted a policy of what he called non-interventionism, just a stepping back and an allowing of the people there to rebuild their city and to create their own prosperity. And while that chapter is also another very sad reminder of how the conditions for progress can be lost, we now know that the pillars upon which Hong Kong's prosperity were built, the fiscal probity, civil liberties, limited government, economic freedom, all of these things are now crumbling in the fists of the Chinese Communist Party. The lesson, the historic policy lesson of Hong Kong is still worth remembering, just how much people can accomplish when they are allowed to.
Before we go to questions from our fellows, what are you working on next? Did I read something about people of progress?
Yes. My former colleague Alexander Hammond is coming out with a book in March called Heroes of Progress, about some of the individual innovators who changed the world. And it's going to have a matching cover. They're going to look great as a set. So I encourage people when that comes out to consider getting that book as well.
Love that. Where can our fellows find your book? I think it would make a great stocking stuffer or gift.
Thank you. They can find it on CATO's website, CATO Books, but really wherever books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, Target, and so forth. And I do want to point out, although I know that the fellows are not themselves educators, many of them know educators, and all of them have educators among their constituents and the people in their community, that there are free lesson plans available online to accompany the different chapters in this book. And it's a great resource for teachers at the high school level. It's not dumbed down. In fact, we know that the book's even being assigned at the university level, for example, at the University of Toronto. But this is such an accessible read, again, with these bite-sized chapters, that it's also very easy to read for high schoolers, maybe even middle schoolers. And when young people take away these lessons from history, that also helps to change the way the public thinks and create the conditions for future progress.
Okay, well, Chelsea, this has been excellent. I have one last question for you. I was really encouraged by the themes in your book as it relates to this network that we're building of leaders here at the foundation through this fellowship. And you basically just make the point that wherever people are gathered and able to freely exchange ideas, then strategy, innovation, and creativity happen. So do you have any last encouragement for our fellows who are part of this growing network?
To continue cultivating their connections within this network and others, because it is not individual people, although I'm obviously an individualist, but networks of people, as you say, that we see again and again throughout history, have helped to change the world in a positive way. There's something that Nat Ridley, who kindly provided the foreword to the book, says in that foreword. He says, progress is a team sport that happens more between minds than within them. And I think that's very wise. And we do see that again and again, whether it's in the salons of Enlightenment era Paris, or the reading societies of Edinburgh during the Scottish Enlightenment, or the marketplaces of ancient Athens. It's when people gather together and they make these connections and they engage in debate about what kind of society do we want to create, how do we want to move forward, that's where we see new ideas emerge that take the world by storm.
So good. Well, thank you so much for your time tonight. We appreciate it.